Go stand with the other wives, Amanda, my husband Kyle whispered harshly, his breath hot against my ear as he practically pushed me toward the corner where corporate spouses clustered like forgotten ornaments. The board members are here tonight. This is serious business, not social hour. His voice carried that particular edge I'd learned to recognize over 5 years of marriage.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
The one that meant I was about to become invisible for the remainder of the evening. I watched him stride back to his colleagues at Holloway Industries with renewed confidence, his shoulders squaring as he prepared to network his way toward the promotion that had consumed his thoughts for months. 20 minutes later, I stood alone in my red designer dress, holding a crystal glass of champagne that had long since gone flat, watching Kyle pitch outdated logistics solutions to a man who'd been using my revolutionary technology for 3 years. 3 hours after that, Bradley Holloway himself stepped up to the microphone with what he called a surprise announcement that would reshape the future of our industry. My pulse quickened as I moved from the wives' corner to the back of the ballroom, positioning myself where I could see Kyle's face clearly. Please welcome our new Chief Executive Officer of Global Commerce International's Innovation Division, Bradley announced, his voice carrying across the stunned silence, Amanda Reynolds. I raised my champagne glass toward Kyle's table as every head in the room turned toward me, including my husband's horrified stare. Actually, I said, my voice carrying clearly in the crystal silence, you can call me Mrs. Reynolds Sampson. Though after tonight, just Reynolds will do fine. The sound of Kyle's chair scraping against marble as he shot to his feet echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Sometimes the sweetest Christmas gift is watching someone realize they've been sleeping next to their new boss for 5 years while treating her like the hired help. The story really began 6 hours earlier, in the master bedroom of our pristine suburban home in Edina, Minnesota, where I stood before a full-length mirror applying the final touches to makeup that had taken 45 minutes to perfect. The reflection staring back at me was exactly what Kyle expected for tonight's event. Elegant but not ostentatious, beautiful but not attention-grabbing. Sophisticated enough to belong at the most important corporate gathering of the year, but not so striking that I might overshadow his networking efforts. The red dress had cost $3,000, money I'd earned from a consulting contract Kyle knew nothing about, though he'd complimented the purchase when I'd claimed to have found it on sale downtown. The irony of lying about affording luxury with money from work he dismissed as inconsequential wasn't lost on me. Nothing about my life seemed lost on me anymore, which was perhaps the most painful realization of all. Amanda, are you almost ready? Kyle's voice drifted up from the foyer, where I knew he was adjusting his bow tie for the dozenth time while reviewing the mental notes he'd prepared for tonight's strategic conversations. We need to be there by 7 if I want to catch Bradley Holloway before the cocktail hour gets too crowded. 2 minutes, I called back, though I'd been ready for 10. The extra time had been spent studying my reflection, trying to reconcile the woman in the mirror with the one I'd become over the past 5 years of marriage. Somewhere along the way, I'd learned to make myself smaller, quieter, more convenient. Tonight felt different, though I couldn't quite articulate why. Kyle appeared in the doorway, impeccable in his black tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled despite the nervous energy that had kept him fidgeting all day. At 34, he was undeniably handsome in that clean-cut corporate way that photographs well at company events. Looking at him now, I could still see traces of the ambitious man I'd fallen in love with 6 years ago at the Chicago Marketing and Logistics Conference, though that man seemed increasingly buried beneath layers of calculated professionalism and barely contained desperation for advancement. "You look beautiful," he said, but his eyes were already moving past me toward the clock on our bedside table. Perfect for tonight. Bradley's wife will be there along with several other board members' spouses. It's important that you make a good impression. I smoothed the silk of my dress, noting how he'd phrased it. Not that we would make a good impression as a couple, but that I would make a good impression as his accessory. The distinction had become sharper over the years, though I'd been slow to recognize its significance. Of course, I replied, adding diamond earrings that had been a gift from my grandmother, one of the few possessions I still owned that Kyle hadn't somehow incorporated into his narrative of our shared success. I know how important tonight is for you. For us, he corrected automatically, though without much conviction. Kyle had developed the habit of including me in his ambitions as an afterthought, the way someone might mention bringing an umbrella when discussing weekend plans. Necessary perhaps, but hardly central to the main event. The drive to downtown Minneapolis took 22 minutes through December streets lined with snow and twinkling lights that should have felt festive but instead seemed to mock the growing distance between us. Kyle spent the entire journey rehearsing his talking points aloud, practicing casual-seeming transitions between topics that would allow him to showcase his knowledge of industry trends and his vision for Holloway Industries' future growth. The key is to mention the Midwest expansion possibilities without seeming too aggressive, he murmured, adjusting his rearview mirror to check his appearance at a red light. Bradley's been talking about Chicago for months, and if I can position myself as the logical choice to spearhead that initiative. I nodded at appropriate intervals while watching the city lights blur past my window, my mind elsewhere. 3 blocks from the hotel, we passed the gleaming office complex that housed Reynolds Supply Chain Solutions, though Kyle had never bothered to visit despite my mentioning it numerous times over the years. The lights were still on in several windows, my team working late to finalize the quarterly reports that would show record-breaking performance for the 3rd consecutive period. Kyle had no idea that the consulting work he dismissed as Amanda's little projects had evolved into a 47-person company generating 8-figure annual revenue. He'd never asked for specifics about my work beyond polite inquiries that expected equally polite, vague responses. When colleagues or friends showed genuine interest in my business, Kyle had perfected the art of the subtle redirect, steering conversations back toward topics where he could contribute meaningfully. "You seem quiet tonight," he observed, as we pulled into the Grand Marriott's valet parking area. "Everything all right?" "Just thinking about the evening ahead," I replied truthfully, though not in the way he interpreted. The hotel's lobby was already buzzing with early arrivals when we entered, the marble floors clicking under the heels of women in evening gowns, while men in tuxedos clustered around the bar, their voices carrying the particular energy of corporate networking events. Kyle's demeanor shifted the moment we crossed the threshold, his spine straightening, and his smile becoming more practiced as he scanned the crowd for familiar faces and strategic opportunities. "There's Ryan Miles," he said, under his breath, nodding toward a silver-haired man near the concierge desk. "Perfect timing. I want to talk to him about the logistics optimization project before he gets pulled into other conversations." Ryan Miles was Kyle's direct supervisor, the current director of operations whose job Kyle coveted with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I'd met Ryan and his wife Sharon numerous times at company events, where they'd always been gracious and surprisingly interested in my work, more interested, in fact, than my own husband typically showed. "Ryan," Kyle called out as we approached, his voice pitched at exactly the right level of enthusiasm. "Sharon, you look lovely tonight. Have you met my wife Amanda?" "Of course," Sharon replied warmly, kissing my cheek in greeting. "Amanda, how wonderful to see you again. Ryan was just telling me about that fascinating article you sent him last month about predictive analytics and supply chain management." He's been implementing some of those strategies with remarkable results. I felt Kyle's subtle tension at my elbow, the way he always responded when my professional knowledge received acknowledgement he couldn't easily redirect or diminish.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Amanda does stay current with industry trends, he said, with that particular laugh that made my skin crawl. Always forwarding me interesting articles and research papers. It's helpful having someone who can keep track of all the technical developments while I focus on the strategic implementation. The casual dismissal was so smooth, so practiced, that Sharon might have missed it entirely if she hadn't been looking directly at me when he spoke. I saw something flicker in her expression, a moment of recognition perhaps, or confusion about why Kyle was crediting himself with expertise that clearly belonged to me. Actually, I said carefully, I didn't forward that article to Kyle. I wrote it. It was published in the Journal of Modern Logistics last quarter. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it felt eternal. Ryan's eyebrows rose slightly, Sharon's smile became more fixed, and Kyle's jaw tightened in a way I'd learned to recognize as barely controlled annoyance. Amanda's very modest about her writing, Kyle said quickly, his hand finding my lower back in what appeared to be an affectionate gesture but felt more like a warning. She doesn't like to make a big deal about her little publications. Little publications. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, not because it was particularly cruel by Kyle's standards, but because it was so perfectly representative of how he'd systematically minimized my achievements over the years. The Journal of Modern Logistics was the most prestigious publication in our industry, and the article he'd just dismissed had been cited in dozens of subsequent papers, and led to 3 Fortune 500 companies requesting consultations. Well, Ryan said, his tone carefully neutral, whoever wrote it, the insights have been invaluable. We've reduced our distribution costs by 37% since implementing those recommendations. That's wonderful, I replied, forcing enthusiasm into my voice, while Kyle's hand pressed more firmly against my back. I'm so glad the strategies worked well for your specific operational challenges. You should really consider speaking at the next industry conference, Sharon suggested. I'm sure attendees would be fascinated to hear about practical applications of your research. Actually, Kyle interjected smoothly, Amanda prefers to keep her consulting work low-key. She's not really comfortable with public speaking or the conference circuit. Too much attention makes her nervous, don't you, sweetheart? I stared at him for a moment. This man who had never asked whether I enjoyed public speaking, who had no idea that I'd delivered keynote addresses at conferences he'd never heard of, who was now confidently describing my comfort level with activities I'd been successfully engaging in for years. Something like that, I murmured, my voice barely audible above the growing din of the cocktail hour that was beginning to swell around us. The conversation with Ryan and Sharon Miles proved to be a perfect microcosm of the evening ahead. As more colleagues and industry contacts approached our small group, I watched Kyle execute a masterclass in subtle professional erasure. Each time someone showed interest in my work, he found a way to redirect the conversation while simultaneously claiming credit for achievements that were entirely mine. When Marcus Holloway, Bradley's nephew who ran the European operations, joined our circle and mentioned hearing impressive things about predictive analytics implementations at several major retailers, Kyle smoothly inserted himself into the conversation. It's fascinating work, he said with the authority of someone who had spent years studying the field. The key is understanding that traditional forecasting models simply can't capture the complexity of modern consumer behavior patterns. I stood silently beside him, watching him paraphrase concepts I'd developed and published, listening to him explain my own theories with the confidence of someone who believed he understood them better than their creator. Marcus nodded along, clearly impressed by Kyle's apparent expertise, while I sipped champagne and wondered how long I'd been complicit in my own professional disappearance. The real breakthrough, Kyle continued, warming to his theme, comes when you integrate social media sentiment analysis with traditional sales data. Most companies are still thinking in silos, but the future belongs to those who can synthesize multiple data streams into actionable insights. Sharon Miles caught my eye over her wine glass. Her expression unreadable but somehow knowing. She'd been married to a corporate executive for 25 years. Perhaps she recognized the dynamics at play more clearly than I'd given her credit for. That's exactly what Amanda wrote about in her article, Sharon said quietly, her words cutting through Kyle's monologue like a blade. The integration of disparate data sources to create more accurate demand forecasting models. Kyle's stride faltered for just a moment before he recovered. Absolutely. Amanda's always been good at synthesizing research from multiple sources. It's helpful having someone who can keep track of all the academic literature while I focus on practical implementation strategies. The dismissal was so casual, so complete, that I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly, but a crystalline clarity about what I was watching happen. Kyle wasn't just taking credit for my work. He was rewriting the fundamental nature of our professional relationship, casting me as a research assistant to his visionary leadership. Marcus Holloway's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it apologetically. I'm sorry, I need to take this. But Kyle, I'd love to continue this conversation later. We're always looking for innovative approaches to optimize our distribution networks. As Marcus stepped away to answer his call, Kyle turned to me with obvious "That went perfectly," he said, under his breath. Did you see how interested he was? If I can get him to champion my ideas with Bradley. Your ideas? The words escaped before I could stop them. Kyle frowned, his good mood evaporating. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, I said quickly, recognizing the warning signs of a public argument that would only make the evening more uncomfortable for everyone involved. I'm just going to step away for a moment, get some air. I excused myself from the group and made my way toward the hotel's mezzanine level, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the Minneapolis skyline. The city spread out below me in a grid of lights, each one representing someone's ambitions, someone's dreams, someone's carefully constructed life. Somewhere out there, my own company was operating under my maiden name, building innovations that were reshaping an entire industry, while I stood in a hotel ballroom, pretending to be nothing more than a corporate wife with expensive taste in evening wear. Rough evening, a voice asked behind me. I turned to find Dr. Patricia Webb, whom I recognized from industry publications though we'd never met in person. Patricia was a legend in logistics technology, someone whose research had influenced my own work in significant ways. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, and the kind of confidence that came from decades of being the smartest person in most rooms. Dr. Webb, I said, genuinely surprised. I didn't realize you'd be here tonight. Patricia, please. And yes, Bradley and I go way back. I consulted for Holloway Industries during their expansion into European markets. She moved to stand beside me at the window, her champagne glass catching the light from the chandeliers behind us. I couldn't help but overhear part of your husband's conversation downstairs. Interesting theories about predictive analytics integration. Yes, he's very passionate about the subject. Patricia's smile was knowing. I'm sure he is, though I have to say, those concepts sounded remarkably similar to some groundbreaking work being done by Amanda Reynolds at Reynolds Supply Chain Solutions. Have you heard of her? My heart stopped for a moment, then began beating so fast I worried it might be audible. I'm familiar with her work. Brilliant woman, revolutionary thinking about demand forecasting and supply chain optimization. Her case study on the Henderson retail turnaround was absolutely masterful. Patricia paused, studying my face with the careful attention of someone who was used to reading people. You know, you have the same thoughtful way of speaking about logistics challenges that I've noticed in her presentations. Very analytical, very precise. I felt my carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. Here was someone who actually understood the work I'd been doing, who recognized its significance, who was treating me with the kind of professional respect I'd forgotten existed. "Thank you," I said quietly. "That's very kind of you to say." Kind has nothing to do with it. I'm simply recognizing expertise when I see it. Patricia's tone became more direct. "Amanda, may I ask you something personal?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "How long have you been letting other people take credit for your achievements?" The question hit like a physical blow. I turned away from the window, looking back toward the ballroom, where Kyle was no doubt continuing to hold court with his borrowed expertise. Charming colleagues with insights he'd never bothered to understand when they came from his own wife. "I don't know what you mean," I said weakly. "Of course you do. You're Amanda Reynolds, aren't you? The Amanda Reynolds, whose algorithms have saved Fortune 500 companies millions of dollars in distribution costs. The Amanda Reynolds, who's been quietly revolutionizing supply chain management while apparently pretending to be nothing more than a supportive corporate spouse." The facade crumbled completely. I felt tears threatening and forced them back, unwilling to break down in front of someone I respected so deeply. "How did you know?" "Your husband's insights were word-for-word excerpts from your published papers. Either he's an incredibly gifted plagiarist, or you've been feeding him material for years while he takes the credit." Patricia's expression softened slightly. "The question is why?" I looked back toward the ballroom, where Kyle was now deep in conversation with another group of executives, his hands moving animatedly as he no doubt shared more of my theories as his own discoveries. "I honestly don't know anymore," I admitted. "It started so gradually that I didn't notice it happening. One day I was his equal partner, the next I was his research assistant, and somewhere along the way I became invisible entirely." "Well," Patricia said, raising her champagne glass, "tonight seems like as good a night as any to become visible again." Patricia's words followed me back down to the ballroom, where the cocktail hour was reaching its crescendo of forced networking and strategic positioning. I found Kyle exactly where I'd expected, surrounded by a larger group now, holding court near the bar, while gesticulating with the confidence of someone who believed his own performance. "Amanda!" Sharon Miles waved me over to a cluster of women who had gravitated toward the far corner of the room, away from the intense business discussions that dominated the center of the space. "Come meet everyone. We were just talking about how challenging it can be to maintain our own interests while supporting our husbands' careers." The Wives' Corner, as I'd mentally dubbed it over the years, was both a refuge and a prison. Here, accomplished women who had subordinated their ambitions to their husbands' careers made polite conversation about safe topics, while the real business of the evening happened elsewhere. I recognized most of the faces. Miranda Reynolds, the CEO's daughter-in-law who had given up her law practice when her first child was born. Esther Martinez, a former financial analyst who now organized charity events. Sandra Holloway, an architect who hadn't designed a building in 8 years. "Amanda was just telling us about her consulting work," Sharon said, as I joined the circle. "Though I suspect she's being modest about the scope of what she does." "Oh, you work?" asked Miranda with genuine interest. "That's wonderful. So few of us manage to keep our careers going after marriage." "What kind of consulting?" Before I could answer, Sandra laughed. "Let me guess, something that allows you to work from home and set your own schedule. We've all been there. The compromise careers that let us pretend we're still professional women while actually being available whenever our husbands need us." The casual dismissal stung, partly because it wasn't entirely inaccurate. I had structured my business to accommodate Kyle's schedule, declining evening meetings and weekend conferences to avoid conflicts with his social obligations. But Sandra's assumption that this made my work less serious, less valuable, crystallized something I'd been avoiding acknowledging. Actually, I said carefully, I run a supply chain optimization company. We develop predictive analytics systems for retail and manufacturing clients. That sounds fascinating, Esther said politely, though her expression suggested she had no idea what half those words meant. Is it very technical? Somewhat. We work with companies to reduce inventory costs and improve delivery efficiency through better demand forecasting. How clever, Miranda exclaimed, and you can do all of that from your home office. Technology really has made remote work so much more feasible. I started to explain that I actually had a downtown office with 47 employees, then stopped myself. Something about the assumption that my work was small-scale, home-based, and accommodating felt familiar. This was exactly how Kyle described my business to his colleagues, significant enough to mention but not substantial enough to take seriously. It keeps me busy, I said, instead the bland non-answer I'd perfected over years of similar conversations. Well, I think it's wonderful that you found something you enjoy, Sandra said with the particular tone people used when discussing hobbies rather than careers. Ryan was just telling Marcus about some innovative logistics strategies they've been implementing. You probably helped with the research, didn't you? The assumption that my role had been assistive rather than creative was so automatic, so casually delivered, that I almost missed its significance. Here, surrounded by women who had made similar compromises, the idea that I might be the source rather than the supporter of professional innovation was literally unthinkable. Something like that, I murmured, accepting a fresh glass of champagne from a passing waiter. It's so important to stay intellectually engaged, Esther added kindly. I volunteer with the United Way's Strategic Planning Committee, and it really helps me feel like I'm using my business background constructively. I nodded and smiled and made appropriate responses while internally cataloging the assumptions being made about my life. That my work was secondary to Kyle's career. That it was accommodating rather than demanding. That it was helpful rather than groundbreaking. That I was supporting rather than leading. The conversation drifted to safer topics, children's activities, vacation plans, the challenges of managing household staff, while I half listened and watched Kyle across the room. He was deep in conversation with Bradley Holloway now, their heads bent together in the kind of intense discussion that suggested serious business was being conducted. Your husband is certainly making an impression tonight, Sandra observed, following my gaze. Bradley seems very engaged with whatever Kyle is telling him. Kyle's very passionate about logistics innovation, I replied automatically. It shows, he has such a commanding presence when he talks about industry trends. You can tell he really understands the technical complexities. Miranda paused thoughtfully. Does he ever pick your brain about strategies? I imagine your consulting work gives you insights that might be helpful for his corporate planning. The irony was so perfect that I almost laughed out loud. Kyle was at this very moment discussing strategies I had developed, using language I had written, presenting concepts I had originated, while his wife stood 30 feet away being congratulated for potentially contributing research support to his brilliant insights. Occasionally, I said, the understatement of the year delivered with practiced calm. That must be so satisfying, Esther said warmly. Being able to contribute to your husband's success in ways that draw on your own expertise. It's like having the best of both worlds, professional fulfillment and marital partnership. I stared at her, this kind woman who had genuinely meant her comment as an encouragement, and realized she was describing my life exactly as Kyle saw it. I was the supportive wife whose little consulting work provided helpful background research for his important career decisions. My professional achievements were valuable primarily insofar as they served his ambitions. "Excuse me," I said abruptly, setting down my champagne glass. "I need to step outside for a moment." I made my way through the crowded ballroom toward the terrace doors, needing air and space to process what I'd been hearing, not just tonight, but for years. The December air was sharp against my exposed shoulders, but the cold felt cleansing after the suffocating warmth of polite assumptions and careful dismissals. The terrace overlooked the hotel's garden, now dormant under a light coating of snow. In the distance, the lights of downtown Minneapolis twinkled like earthbound stars, and I found myself thinking about the building where my real life existed. The office where my employees were working late to prepare for tomorrow's client presentations. The conference room where my innovations were being refined and implemented. The world where Amanda Reynolds was recognized as a leader rather than dismissed as a helpful hobbyist. Second thoughts about the evening. A voice asked behind me. I turned to find Patricia Webb, wrapped in an elegant wool coat, joining me on the terrace. "Just needed some air," I replied. "I imagine so." That conversation looked illuminating. I studied her face, trying to determine how much she'd overheard. "What do you mean?" "Oh, my dear," Patricia said gently, "I've been watching this industry for 40 years. I know professional erasure when I see it. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before I could answer, the terrace doors opened and Kyle appeared, scanning the area until he spotted me. "There you are," he said, slightly out of breath. "I've been looking everywhere. Bradley wants to meet you." Kyle's announcement created an instant shift in the dynamic on the terrace. Patricia Webb's knowing smile became more pronounced, while Kyle seemed oblivious to anything beyond his own excitement about the opportunity to introduce his wife to the CEO of Holloway Industries. "Mr. Holloway wants to meet me?" I asked, though the question was purely rhetorical. I knew exactly why Bradley Holloway might be interested in meeting Amanda Sampson, and it had nothing to do with my role as Kyle's supportive spouse. "He mentioned that Ryan had told him about your consulting work," Kyle said, already steering me toward the terrace doors. "Apparently he's curious about your perspective on some industry trends. It's a great opportunity to make a good impression." Patricia fell into step beside us as we headed back into the warmth of the ballroom. "How thoughtful of Mr. Holloway to take such an interest in Amanda's professional insights," she said with perfect innocence. Kyle barely acknowledged her comment, too focused on navigating through the crowd, toward where Bradley Holloway was holding court near the bar. As we approached, I could see the CEO was surrounded by the usual collection of senior executives and board members, all angling for FaceTime with the man who controlled their professional futures. Bradley spotted our approach and excused himself from his current conversation, extending his hand toward me with the kind of warm smile that suggested this introduction was anything but casual. "Mrs. Sampson," he said, "Kyle has been telling me fascinating things about your consulting work. I understand you specialize in supply chain optimization." "Among other things," I replied carefully, hyper-aware of Kyle's presence beside me and the dozen other people within earshot of our conversation. "Kyle mentioned that you've been following some interesting developments in predictive analytics. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how those technologies might be applied to large-scale distribution challenges." The question was perfectly crafted to appear casual while actually being quite specific. Bradley wasn't making polite conversation. He was testing my knowledge in ways that would quickly reveal whether Kyle's claims about my expertise were accurate. "Well," I began, choosing my words carefully, "the real potential lies in integrating multiple data streams to create more sophisticated forecasting models. Traditional approaches focus primarily on historical sales data, but modern consumers behave in ways that purely historical analysis can't predict." Kyle nodded enthusiastically beside me, clearly pleased that I was confirming his earlier assertions about my capabilities. What he didn't realize was that Bradley's follow-up questions were becoming increasingly technical, moving far beyond anything Kyle could have explained himself. "That's interesting," Bradley said. "How do you account for seasonal variations when you're working with integrated datasets?" "I imagine the weighting algorithms become quite complex." "They do," I agreed, warming to the subject, despite the surreal nature of discussing my own published research while pretending it was casual insight. "The key is developing dynamic weighting systems that can adjust in real time based on emerging patterns. You can't rely on static seasonal adjustments when consumer behavior is being influenced by social media trends, economic fluctuations, and supply chain disruptions that change weekly." Bradley's expression sharpened with genuine interest. "Have you had success implementing those kinds of dynamic systems in real-world applications?" Before I could answer, Kyle jumped into the conversation. "Amanda's been following some fascinating case studies in this area. The theoretical applications are really quite promising." I felt a familiar stab of frustration at Kyle's intervention, particularly his reduction of my actual implementations to theoretical applications and case studies I'd been following. But Bradley's next question cut through Kyle's attempted redirect with surgical precision. "Mrs. Sampson, I'm curious about your thoughts on the Henderson retail case specifically. Their turnaround has been the talk of the industry, and from what I understand, their success was largely due to revolutionary demand forecasting implementations. Have you studied their approach?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Henderson Retail wasn't just a case study I'd followed. It was the case study that had established my reputation in the industry. The project that had demonstrated the practical applications of my theoretical framework and led to a waiting list of Fortune 500 companies seeking similar transformations. Kyle looked confused, clearly unfamiliar with the Henderson retail situation, despite his confident assertions about my expertise in the field. I could see him trying to formulate a response that would maintain his position as the primary source of insight, while acknowledging my supporting role. "Actually," I said quietly, before Kyle could speak, "I was the lead consultant on the Henderson project." The silence that followed was profound. Kyle's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, shock, and something approaching horror, as the implications began to sink in. Bradley's smile became genuinely pleased. "I thought so. The implementation was far too sophisticated to be anything other than original work. Your paper on integrated demand forecasting was brilliant. I've been hoping to meet you for months." "Paper?" Kyle's voice was barely above a whisper. "Amanda's case study on the Henderson transformation," Bradley explained, clearly enjoying Kyle's obvious discomfort. "It was published in the Journal of Modern Logistics last quarter, required reading for anyone serious about next-generation supply chain management." I watched Kyle's face as the pieces fell into place. The article Ryan Miles had mentioned earlier, the insights he'd been confidently presenting as his own understanding, the expertise he'd been casually dismissing as my little publications while simultaneously using it to advance his own career. "You never mentioned you published a paper," Kyle said weakly. "You never asked," I replied simply. Bradley looked between us with growing understanding of the dynamic he'd stumbled into. "Kyle, you didn't know your wife authored one of the most influential logistics papers of the year." Kyle began, then stopped, clearly unable to formulate an explanation that wouldn't make him look either dishonest or utterly oblivious to his wife's professional achievements. "Perhaps we should discuss this further," Bradley said diplomatically. "Amanda, I'd be very interested in hearing about your current projects. I understand Reynolds Supply Chain Solutions has been developing some groundbreaking applications." The mention of my company name was like dropping a bomb into the conversation. Kyle's eyes widened as he finally began to understand the scope of what he'd been missing, while several other executives who had been half listening suddenly focused their attention entirely on our small group. "Reynolds Supply Chain Solutions?" asked Marcus Holloway, who had appeared at his uncle's elbow. "The company that revolutionized the Morrison Industries distribution network. Amanda, you're the Amanda Reynolds?" Kyle looked like he might faint. "The Amanda Reynolds," he repeated, his voice hollow. "Oh my," Patricia Webb said, appearing beside us with perfect timing, "it seems the cat's out of the bag." And for the first time in 5 years of marriage, I found myself in a conversation where my professional identity wasn't being filtered through Kyle's interpretation or diminished by his assumptions. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying, like stepping into sunlight after years in a dimly lit room. The circle of executives around us had grown larger, drawn by the magnetic pull of a professional scandal unfolding in real time. Word was spreading through the ballroom with the efficiency of a corporate communications network. Kyle Sampson's wife wasn't just a supportive spouse with consulting hobbies, she was Amanda Reynolds, one of the most innovative minds in modern logistics. "I have to admit," Marcus Holloway said, his tone carefully neutral, "I'm somewhat confused about the timeline here. Kyle, you've been describing revolutionary logistics strategies that sound remarkably similar to Amanda's published work, but you seemed unaware that she was the author." Kyle's face had progressed from pale to an alarming shade of red. Beads of sweat were forming at his hairline despite the ballroom's carefully controlled temperature. "Amanda and I discuss industry trends frequently. Sometimes it's difficult to remember which insights originated where." The explanation sounded weak even to my ears, and judging by the expressions around our circle, Kyle's professional reputation was taking damage with every word. "That's understandable," Bradley said, diplomatically, though his tone suggested it was anything but. "Though I'm curious, Amanda, Kyle mentioned earlier that you prefer to keep your consulting work low-key, that public speaking makes you nervous. Yet I could have sworn I saw you deliver the keynote at the International Logistics Conference last spring." The trap was perfectly laid. I could feel Kyle's panic radiating beside me as he realized that his casual dismissals of my capabilities were being systematically dismantled by people who actually knew my professional record. "You were there?" I asked, genuinely surprised. The conference had been in Chicago, and I'd used my maiden name for all the materials. "Front row," Bradley confirmed. "Your presentation on real-time supply chain adaptation was extraordinary. Standing ovation, if I recall correctly. Hardly the behavior of someone uncomfortable with public speaking." Ryan Miles, who had been listening with growing fascination, cleared his throat. "Amanda, forgive me for asking, but how large is Reynolds Supply Chain Solutions? I mean in terms of employees and revenue." The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could feel Kyle's desperate hope that my answer would somehow minimize the scope of what he'd been missing, that I might describe a small operation that wouldn't completely overshadow his middle management career. "We currently employ 47 people," I said quietly. "Last year's revenue was approximately $12.3 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Kyle actually staggered slightly, reaching out to steady himself against a nearby table. $12.3 million was more than Holloway Industries' entire logistics department generated annually. 47 employees, Kyle repeated, his voice barely audible. "You employ 47 people. That's quite impressive," Patricia Webb said warmly. And I understand Global Commerce International has been courting you for an acquisition. The question was delivered with the casual precision of someone who knew exactly what bomb she was dropping. Kyle's head snapped toward me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. "How did you?" I began, then stopped. Patricia's smile told me everything I needed to know about who she really was and why she'd been so interested in my professional situation. "Patricia Webb," Bradley said suddenly, his voice filled with recognition. "You're Patricia Webb from GCI's Strategic Acquisitions team." "Guilty as charged," Patricia replied cheerfully, "though I prefer to think of myself as someone who recognizes exceptional talent when I see it." Kyle looked like he was going to be sick. "Global Commerce International wants to acquire your company." "Wanted," I corrected softly. "The deal was finalized 6 weeks ago." The words seemed to hit Kyle like physical blows. He actually took a step backward, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, recognition, and something approaching despair. "6 weeks ago," he repeated. "6 weeks ago you sold your company to Global Commerce International, and you never mentioned it. You never asked about my work, Kyle. You never showed any interest in the details of what I was building. When people at events like this would try to engage me in professional conversations, you would redirect them or speak for me. You made it very clear that my little consulting projects weren't worth serious discussion." Marcus Holloway was studying Kyle with the expression of someone watching a colleague's career implode in real time. "Kyle, I have to ask, when you were describing those innovative logistics strategies earlier, were you actually describing Amanda's work?" Kyle's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. The truth was written across his face in stark detail. He had been confidently presenting his wife's revolutionary theories as his own insights, never imagining that his audience might recognize their actual source. "I think," Bradley said carefully, "this might be an appropriate time for Amanda and me to have a more detailed conversation about her future plans. Kyle, perhaps you'd like to take a moment to process this evening's revelations." Kyle nodded mutely, looking like a man who had just watched his entire professional identity crumble in the space of a 15-minute conversation. As he walked away from our group, his steps unsteady and his shoulders slumped, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and pity. For 5 years, I had allowed myself to be diminished, dismissed, and professionally erased. Tonight, the truth had finally emerged, and the man who had spent years treating me like an intellectual accessory was discovering the true cost of his assumptions. "Now then," Patricia said briskly, "shall we discuss your new role as CEO of GCI's Innovation Division?" The words hung in the air like a detonation. Around our circle, I watched faces change as the implications sank in. Bradley Holloway's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine surprise, while Marcus looked like he was rapidly recalculating everything he thought he knew about the evening's dynamics. "CEO," Bradley repeated slowly. "Amanda, you're going to be running GCI's new innovation division. Starting January 15th, Patricia confirmed before I could respond. We've been in negotiations for months. Amanda's appointment will be announced publicly next week, along with the acquisition details." I found myself in the surreal position of having my professional future discussed around me while I stood in a red evening gown, still holding a crystal champagne flute, at my husband's company Christmas party. The irony was so sharp it was almost painful. "Well," Marcus said after a moment, "that certainly explains Kyle's confidence about logistics innovation strategies. He must have been getting insider information about next-generation approaches." "Not exactly," I said quietly. The moment had come to set the record straight completely, not just about my identity but about the full scope of what Kyle had been missing. Kyle didn't know about the GCI position. He doesn't know about most aspects of my work. Bradley's eyebrows rose. He doesn't know his wife is about to become one of the most powerful executives in the logistics industry. Kyle and I have had different perspectives on the importance of my career. I chose my words carefully, aware that this conversation would be repeated throughout their professional networks. He's been very focused on his own advancement opportunities. Patricia's smile was knowing. Perhaps we should explain to Mr. Holloway exactly what Kyle has been missing. Over the next few minutes, Patricia and I outlined the true scope of Reynolds Supply Chain Solutions, the Fortune 500 client base, the revolutionary algorithms that had transformed inventory management for dozens of major retailers, the patents that were reshaping how companies approached demand forecasting, the academic papers that had become required reading in business schools. With each revelation, Bradley's expression became more incredulous. Amanda, your Henderson retail case study is being taught at Wharton. Your predictive analytics framework is being implemented by 3 of our biggest competitors. How is it possible that Kyle didn't know about any of this? Because, I said, the words coming easier now, Kyle made it very clear early in our marriage that my work was secondary to his career ambitions. When clients called, he assumed they were small local businesses. When I traveled for conferences, he thought I was attending workshops. When industry publications contacted me, he barely listened when I mentioned it. But the revenue alone, Marcus protested. $12.3 million isn't something you can hide. I wasn't hiding it, I replied. Kyle never asked about the financial details of my consulting work. When he noticed that I was spending more freely, I told him I'd landed some good contracts. He never pushed for specifics because he assumed the amounts weren't significant enough to matter. Bradley shook his head in disbelief. So Kyle has been unknowingly married to one of the most successful logistics consultants in the country while treating her like a supportive hobbyist. That's an accurate summary, Patricia confirmed. Which brings us to tonight's rather dramatic revelation. I looked across the ballroom, where I could see Kyle standing alone near the bar, staring into a glass of whiskey with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just collapsed. Several colleagues had approached him during our conversation, but he'd waved them away, clearly in no condition for social interaction. The position at GCI, I said, returning my attention to our circle, includes relocation to New York and a substantial increase in responsibilities. I'll be overseeing a team of 200 researchers and analysts, with a budget that exceeds the annual revenue of most mid-sized companies. Congratulations, Bradley said, and his tone suggested he genuinely meant it. Though I imagine this creates some personal complications. Some, I agreed, the understatement of the year. Patricia glanced at her watch. Amanda, if you're comfortable with the idea, I think this might be an appropriate time for the public announcement. The evening is reaching that point where people are ready for a keynote moment, and frankly, I think your husband has had enough private revelation for one night. The suggestion sent a chill down my spine. A public announcement would make everything official, irreversible. There would be no more hiding behind Kyle's assumptions, no more pretending to be the supportive spouse whose work was merely supplementary to his career. Are you sure you're ready for this? Bradley asked gently. Once it's public, there's no going back to the way things were. I looked around the ballroom, at the wives clustered in their corner, making polite conversation about safe topics, at the executives networking with desperate intensity, at Kyle standing alone at the bar, confronting the ruins of everything he thought he knew about his life. I've been ready for years, I said finally. I just didn't realize it until tonight. Patricia nodded approvingly. Then let's make this official. Bradley, would you mind introducing Amanda to the room? I think it's time everyone learned who they've been overlooking. As Bradley moved toward the small stage at the front of the ballroom, I felt a profound shift in my sense of self. The woman who had arrived at this party as Kyle's decorative accessory was about to be revealed as one of the most powerful figures in their industry. The careful facade I'd maintained for 5 years was about to crumble completely, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, that felt like freedom rather than exposure. The ballroom gradually quieted as Bradley Holloway stepped up to the microphone, the crystal chandeliers casting dramatic shadows across his distinguished features. Conversations died away in ripples, starting near the stage and spreading outward until 300 guests stood in expectant silence. I remained near the back of the room, positioned where I could observe the crowd's reactions while staying close to the exit if I needed to escape quickly. Patricia stood beside me, her expression radiating quiet satisfaction, while Marcus had moved closer to the stage to get a better view of the proceedings. Kyle was still at the bar, but I could see him straightening slightly as his boss took the microphone. Despite everything that had happened tonight, his corporate instincts were still intact. When the CEO spoke, you paid attention. Ladies and gentlemen, Bradley began, his voice carrying easily through the sound system. Thank you all for joining us tonight. This annual celebration has always been special to me because it represents not just the end of another successful year, but the beginning of new possibilities. The opening was standard corporate rhetoric, but I could detect subtle tension in Bradley's tone that suggested he was about to deviate from the expected script. This year has been particularly significant for Holloway Industries, he continued. We've seen unprecedented growth, expanded our client base by 43%, and achieved efficiency improvements that have exceeded even our most optimistic projections. Murmurs of approval rippled through the audience. Kyle's posture improved further. This was the kind of company celebration that typically led to recognition and advancement opportunities. Much of this success can be attributed to our partnerships with innovative companies that share our vision for the future of logistics, Bradley said, his eyes finding mine across the crowded room. Tonight I'm pleased to share some exciting developments that will reshape not just our industry, but our understanding of what's possible when true innovation meets strategic implementation. The anticipation in the room was palpable now. This was clearly building towards something significant, though most of the audience had no idea what was coming. Many of you have heard about the revolutionary changes happening in supply chain management, Bradley continued. Predictive analytics, integrated demand forecasting, real-time optimization systems that are transforming how companies think about distribution and inventory management. I could see Kyle nodding along with the rest of the audience, probably congratulating himself on his earlier conversations about these exact topics. What you may not know is that many of these innovations have come from a single company, led by one of the most brilliant minds in modern logistics. Reynolds Supply Chain Solutions, under the leadership of Amanda Reynolds, has been quietly revolutionizing our industry, while most of us were still thinking in traditional terms. The first ripple of recognition passed through the crowd. Several people turned to look around the room, clearly wondering if this Amanda Reynolds was present among them. Tonight, Bradley said, pausing for dramatic effect, I'm thrilled to announce that Ms. Reynolds has accepted the position of Chief Executive Officer for Global Commerce International's new Innovation Division, effective January 15th. The applause began immediately, but it was confused, uncertain. People were clapping because they recognized that this was an important announcement, but most of them had no context for understanding what it meant. Furthermore, Bradley continued as the applause died down, I'm pleased to reveal that Amanda Reynolds has been working among us this evening, though perhaps not in the capacity many of you expected." This time the silence was absolute. I could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes scanning the room, searching for someone they might have missed, someone who looked like a CEO designate, rather than a corporate spouse. Amanda Bradley called out, looking directly at me, "Would you please join me on stage?" The moment stretched like eternity. Every head in the room turned toward the back corner where I stood, their expressions cycling through confusion, recognition, and dawning shock as they realized that the woman they'd been casually dismissing all evening was actually one of the most powerful people in their industry. I began walking toward the stage, my heels clicking against the marble floor in the profound silence. As I passed Kyle's position at the bar, I could see his face in my peripheral vision, white as paper, his mouth slightly open, his eyes tracking my movement with the expression of someone watching his entire world collapse in real time. The walk to the stage felt both endless and instantaneous. With each step, I could feel the weight of 5 years of diminishment falling away, replaced by something I'd almost forgotten existed, the confidence that came from being seen and recognized for who I actually was. When I reached the stage, Bradley extended his hand to help me up the steps, and for the first time all evening, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bradley announced as I took my place beside him at the microphone, "Amanda Reynolds, soon to be one of the most influential executives in the logistics industry." The applause this time was thunderous, but it carried an undertone of shock and confusion that made it unlike any corporate recognition I'd ever witnessed. People were clapping for an achievement they were still trying to understand, celebrating a revelation that had fundamentally altered their perception of the evening's dynamics. I looked out over the crowd, seeing familiar faces transformed by surprise and newfound respect. Sharon Miles was beaming with obvious delight. Miranda and the other wives from our earlier conversation looked stunned, but genuinely pleased. Ryan Miles appeared to be rapidly recalculating every interaction he'd had with Kyle's supportive wife over the past several years. And Kyle looked like a man who had just watched his carefully constructed professional identity crumble into dust. "Thank you," I said into the microphone, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "This is unexpected." A ripple of laughter passed through the audience at my understated response, breaking some of the tension that had built during Bradley's announcement. I adjusted the microphone slightly, taking a moment to scan the faces before me, faces that had viewed me one way all evening, and were now struggling to reconcile that perception with this new reality. When I arrived tonight, I began finding my rhythm as I had at countless conferences and board presentations. I came as Kyle Sampson's wife, planning to spend the evening making polite conversation about safe topics while my husband networked for his career advancement. Another murmur passed through the crowd. Several people glanced toward Kyle, who remained frozen at the bar like a statue of corporate mortification. What I didn't expect was to find myself in conversations where my professional achievements were being discussed as if they belonged to someone else. I continued, my tone remaining light despite the sharp edge of my words. "It's fascinating to hear your own innovations explained back to you by people who have never asked about the details of your work." The ballroom had gone silent again, but this time it was the silence of people beginning to understand the scope of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a career announcement, it was the public revelation of years of professional invisibility. 5 years ago, I founded Reynolds Supply Chain Solutions with a simple mission to revolutionize how companies understand and predict consumer demand. Tonight, I learned that my husband has been quite enthusiastically sharing my theories with his colleagues, though apparently without realizing where those insights originated. I could see Kyle's face clearly from the stage, and the expression of dawning horror was almost painful to witness. He was finally understanding not just what he'd lost, but how completely he'd misunderstood what he'd had. The Henderson retail transformation that's been cited as a game-changing case study. That was my team's work. The predictive analytics framework that's being taught at business schools across the country. Those are my algorithms. The demand forecasting innovations that have saved Fortune 500 companies millions in inventory costs. Those came from my research. With each revelation, I could see the audience's perception shifting. The polite corporate wives they'd been casually dismissing throughout the evening were looking at me with new respect, while the executives who had spent the night networking were realizing they'd overlooked the most important person in the room. But perhaps the most interesting development, I said, allowing a slight smile to play across my lips, is discovering that my work has been so influential that even my own husband has been unconsciously promoting it at industry events. This time the laughter was more genuine, though still edged with discomfort. Everyone could see Kyle's visible anguish from across the room. The position at Global Commerce International represents more than just a career opportunity, I continued, shifting to a more serious tone. It's a chance to implement innovation strategies on a scale that can transform entire industries. Starting in January, I'll be overseeing the development of next-generation logistics technologies that will reshape how companies approach supply chain management. But tonight has taught me something equally important about the power of visibility. For too long, I've allowed my achievements to be filtered through other people's interpretations. I've accommodated assumptions and accepted diminishment because it seemed easier than correcting misconceptions. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the audience before settling on Kyle's stricken face. My husband spent this evening confidently presenting revolutionary logistics strategies to industry leaders, never realizing he was describing work created by the woman he dismissed as having little consulting projects. The irony is almost perfect. He was trying to impress people with expertise that literally slept beside him every night. The silence now was absolute. Everyone understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, a public accounting of professional erasure delivered with surgical precision. Innovation often comes from unexpected places, I said, returning to a more diplomatic tone. Sometimes the most revolutionary solutions are developed by people who are systematically overlooked or underestimated. Tonight is about changing that dynamic. I looked directly at the wives' corner, where Miranda, Sandra, and the others stood with expressions of recognition and something approaching vindication. To the women in this room who have subordinated your ambitions to support your husbands' careers, who have accepted being introduced as just wives while your expertise goes unrecognized, tonight is also for you. Your intelligence, your capabilities, your potential contributions don't disappear just because they're inconvenient for someone else's narrative. The applause that followed was different from any corporate recognition I'd ever received. It was personal, emotional, charged with the energy of people who had seen their own experiences reflected in my words. The logistics industry is about to change dramatically, I concluded. At GCI, we'll be developing technologies that most people can't yet imagine. But more importantly, we'll be creating an environment where innovation is recognized regardless of who creates it, where brilliant ideas are valued regardless of their source. I stepped back from the microphone as applause filled the ballroom, but my eyes remained fixed on Kyle. He was still standing at the bar, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand, looking like a man who had just watched his entire understanding of his life revealed as a delusion. Bradley returned to the microphone as the applause died down. I think we can all agree that Amanda's appointment represents a new chapter not just for Global Commerce International, but for our industry as a whole. Please join me in congratulating our incoming CEO. As the crowd surged forward to offer congratulations, I realized that the woman who had poured coffee while being called just a pretty face was finally completely gone forever. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of handshakes, congratulations, and business cards pressed into my palm by executives who suddenly found my expertise invaluable. The transformation was so complete and immediate that it felt almost surreal. The same people who had been making polite small talk with Kyle's wife were now seeking strategic advice from the incoming CEO of GCI's innovation division. Amanda, I had no idea, Sharon Miles said, grasping my hands with genuine warmth. All those times we talked about supporting our husbands' careers, and you were building an empire right under our noses.
Not under your noses, I corrected gently. I talked about my work constantly. The problem was that everyone, including me sometimes, had been trained to minimize its importance. Marcus Holloway approached with Patricia Webb, both wearing expressions of professional admiration mixed with personal fascination. I have to ask, Marcus said, how long have you been planning tonight's revelation? The timing is extraordinary. I wasn't planning anything, I replied honestly. Tonight was supposed to be about Kyle's networking opportunities. I had no intention of my appointment becoming public until next week. Patricia's smile was knowing. Sometimes the universe has its own schedule for these things. Though I have to admit, watching Kyle discover his wife's true professional stature in real time was quite illuminating. Across the ballroom, I could see Kyle still standing at the bar, though he was no longer alone. Ryan Miles had approached him, and judging by Kyle's body language, the conversation was not going well. Ryan's expression was carefully neutral, but I could read the professional distance that had suddenly appeared between them. Miss Reynolds, a voice said behind me, and I turned to find Dr. James Chen, the Northwestern professor I'd met earlier. I wanted to thank you for tonight's presentation. My students are going to find your insights about professional visibility absolutely fascinating. Your students? I teach a course on leadership dynamics in corporate environments. Tonight has been a masterclass in how unconscious bias can blind us to expertise that's literally standing right in front of us. He paused thoughtfully. Would you consider guest lecturing when your schedule permits? I think our MBA students would benefit enormously from your perspective. Before I could respond, another group approached, 3 executives from competing logistics companies, who had been at the party as Bradley's guests. The shift in their demeanor from polite corporate courtesy to genuine professional interest was remarkable. Amanda, said the first, a woman named Dr. Sarah Mitchell from Peterson Logistics, I've been following your work for months through industry publications. We've been hoping to schedule a consultation about predictive analytics implementation, though I suppose that's off the table now, added her colleague with a rueful smile, given that you'll be working with our biggest competitor. Actually, I said, an idea forming. One of my priorities at GCI will be establishing industry-wide standards for next-generation logistics technologies. Collaboration rather than exclusivity serves everyone's interests better. The conversation continued for several more minutes, covering technical details and strategic implications that would have been impossible an hour earlier when these same people viewed me as Kyle's supportive spouse rather than a peer in their industry. Eventually, the crowd around me began to thin as people returned to their own conversations, and I found myself with a brief moment to observe the transformed dynamics of the ballroom. The wives' corner had essentially dissolved. Miranda was deep in conversation with 2 board members about her legal background, while Sandra was showing architectural sketches on her phone to an executive whose company was planning a new headquarters. But it was Kyle's situation that drew my attention most sharply. He remained at the bar, but the isolation was no longer voluntary. Several colleagues had approached him throughout the evening, but the conversations were brief and increasingly strained.
Word was spreading through the professional network with the speed of corporate gossip. Kyle Sampson had spent years dismissing his wife's groundbreaking work while simultaneously claiming expertise in her innovations. "Rough night for your husband," Patricia observed, following my gaze. "Rough night for the man he's been pretending to be," I corrected. "The man he actually is might survive this, but his professional reputation is going to need significant rehabilitation." And personally, I considered the question while watching Kyle stare into his drink with the expression of someone contemplating the wreckage of everything he thought he knew about his life. Personally, we have some very difficult conversations ahead of us. Tonight has made it impossible to continue pretending that our marriage is based on mutual respect and understanding. Bradley Holloway approached, having finished his own round of post-announcement conversations. "Amanda, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but tonight has been extraordinary. I've been in corporate leadership for 30 years, and I've never seen anyone handle such a complex revelation with such grace and professionalism. Thank you, though I have to admit, there's something liberating about finally being able to discuss my work without having to downplay its significance." "I imagine so. And Kyle," he glanced toward the bar, "how is he processing tonight's developments?" "About as well as you'd expect from someone who just discovered that his entire professional identity was built on borrowed expertise he never bothered to understand." Bradley nodded thoughtfully. "The logistics industry is smaller than people realize. Word of tonight's events will spread quickly through professional networks. Kyle's going to need to decide whether he wants to rebuild his reputation based on his actual capabilities, or continue living in denial about what happened here. That's his choice to make," I replied. "I spent 5 years accommodating his assumptions and protecting his ego. I won't be doing that anymore." As if summoned by our conversation, Kyle finally left his position at the bar, and began walking toward us. His stride was unsteady, whether from alcohol or emotional shock, and his face bore the expression of someone preparing for a conversation he desperately wanted to avoid. Kyle's approach created an invisible bubble of tension around our small group. Bradley and Patricia exchanged glances, both clearly recognizing that they were about to witness a very personal conversation played out in a very public space. Marcus had drifted away moments earlier, perhaps sensing the coming storm. "Amanda," Kyle said when he reached us, his voice hoarse and barely controlled. "We need to talk." "Of course," I replied calmly, "though I'm not sure what you'd like to discuss that hasn't already been covered this evening." Bradley cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should give you some privacy." "No," Kyle interrupted, his voice louder than he'd intended. Several nearby conversations paused as heads turned in our direction. "No, I think everyone should hear this, since apparently my entire life has become public entertainment tonight." I studied his face, seeing desperation mixed with anger, and something that might have been betrayal. "Kyle, you're upset. Maybe we should continue this conversation at home." He laughed bitterly. "You mean the home you bought with money from a company I didn't know existed? The home where you've been living a completely separate life while letting me make a fool of myself?" Patricia stepped slightly closer, her expression alert. She'd spent decades in corporate acquisitions. She recognized the signs of a professional meltdown in progress. "I never let you do anything," I said quietly. "You made assumptions, Kyle. You decided that my work wasn't important enough to investigate. You dismissed my achievements without ever asking for details. Because you hid them from me." Kyle's voice was rising again, drawing more attention from around the ballroom. $12 million, Amanda. $12 million in revenue, and you never mentioned it. I mentioned my work constantly. You chose not to listen. You mentioned consulting projects, small contracts. You never said you were running a Fortune 500 company. "I'm not running a Fortune 500 company," I corrected. I was running a successful consulting firm that happened to serve Fortune 500 clients. There's a difference. Bradley attempted another diplomatic intervention. Kyle, perhaps this conversation would be better suited to a more private setting. More private. Kyle turned on him with wild eyes. Like the private setting where you've apparently been planning my wife's career without mentioning it to me. How long have you known Bradley? How long have you all been laughing at the idiot husband who didn't know his wife was smarter than he was? The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Around us, conversations had stopped entirely as people realized they were witnessing something far more dramatic than typical corporate networking. No one has been laughing at you, I said firmly. But Kyle, you spent this entire evening presenting my work as your own insights. You confidently explained my theories to industry leaders while having no idea where those concepts originated. The irony was lost on you, but it wasn't lost on anyone else. Because you never told me they were your theories. I published them in academic journals. I presented them at conferences. I implemented them for clients whose success stories made industry news. The information was available to anyone who cared enough to pay attention. Kyle's face was flushed with alcohol and humiliation. So this is my fault. I'm supposed to read every academic paper my wife publishes. I'm supposed to track down every conference she attends. You're supposed to show basic interest in your wife's professional life, Patricia said quietly, her voice cutting through Kyle's bluster with surgical precision. You're supposed to know what she does for a living. Kyle spun toward her. Who asked you? This is between my wife and me. Actually, Patricia replied with perfect calm, as the executive who recruited Amanda for her new position, I have a professional interest in ensuring she's supported by her personal relationships. Tonight has been quite illuminating in that regard. Recruited? Kyle's voice cracked slightly. You recruited her? How long has this been going on? I took a deep breath, recognizing that we'd reached the point where the complete truth was inevitable. 6 months, Kyle. Global Commerce International approached me 6 months ago about the acquisition and the CEO position. The silence that followed was profound. Kyle stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language, his brain clearly struggling to process the timeline implications. 6 months, he repeated slowly. For 6 months, you've been planning to leave Minneapolis, leave your marriage, start a new life, and you never mentioned it. I've been planning to accept a career opportunity, I corrected. The personal implications were something I was still working through. Working through? Kyle's laugh was harsh and bitter. Working through whether to tell your husband that you're about to become more successful than he'll ever be. Working through whether to mention that you're leaving him behind while you conquer the corporate world. The pain in his voice was genuine, and for a moment I felt a flicker of the sympathy that had kept me accommodating his limitations for 5 years. But only for a moment. I was working through whether our marriage could survive the truth, I said quietly. Tonight answered that question. Kyle's face went pale. What's that supposed to mean? It means that this evening has made it clear that you can't handle being married to someone whose success overshadows yours. You can't accept being the supportive spouse instead of the star. And I can't continue making myself smaller so you can feel bigger. The words hung between us like a verdict, final and irreversible. Around us, the ballroom had gone completely silent, 300 people watching the public dissolution of a marriage that had been built on fundamentally false premises. Kyle's shoulders sagged as the implications hit him fully. So that's it? 5 years of marriage over. Just like that? Not just like that, Kyle. 5 years of watching you diminish my achievements. 5 years of accommodating your assumption that your career mattered more than mine. 5 years of being introduced as your supportive wife while my own work was dismissed as unimportant hobbies. I paused, looking around the silent ballroom before returning my gaze to his stricken face. Tonight didn't end our marriage, Kyle. Tonight just made it impossible to pretend that our marriage was ever based on mutual respect. The silence that followed my words was so complete that I could hear the faint hum of the hotel's air conditioning system. 300 people stood frozen in tableau, witnesses to the complete unraveling of what had appeared to be a successful corporate marriage. Kyle's face cycled through several expressions: shock, denial, anger, and finally something approaching desperation. "Amanda, you can't be serious. We can work this out. I know I made mistakes tonight, but mistakes?" I interrupted, my voice calm but carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "Kyle, this wasn't a series of mistakes. This was 5 years of systematic dismissal. Tonight was just the first time it happened in front of people who actually knew better. I never dismissed you. You introduced me as someone who keeps busy with little hobbies, while I was generating more revenue than your entire department. You spoke for me every time someone showed professional interest in my work. You confidently explained my own theories to industry leaders while describing me as someone who doesn't understand the corporate world." Each example hit Kyle like a physical blow. Around us, I could see nods of recognition from people who had witnessed these exact dynamics play out throughout the evening. "But I was proud of your work," Kyle protested weakly. "I always supported your consulting." "You were proud of having a wife who was smart enough to make you look good, but not threatening enough to overshadow you," I corrected. "The moment you discovered the true scope of what I'd built, your first reaction was anger at being left out, not pride in my achievements." Patricia Webb stepped forward slightly, her expression professional but sympathetic. "Kyle, I think Amanda has made her position quite clear. Perhaps it would be best if—" "Best for who?" Kyle snapped, his composure finally cracking completely. "Best for the corporate acquisition team that's been secretly recruiting my wife. Best for the industry leaders who've been watching me make a fool of myself. Best for everyone except the man whose life is being destroyed on national television." "We're not on television," Bradley said quietly, "but I understand your frustration. However, Amanda's professional decisions aren't subject to your approval, and this public confrontation isn't helping anyone." Kyle turned on him with wild eyes. "Professional decisions? She's leaving the state. She's ending our marriage. She's taking a job that will make her more powerful than anyone in this room. And you call that a professional decision?" "I call it an inevitability," Bradley replied with careful neutrality. "Amanda's talents were always going to be recognized eventually. Tonight simply accelerated that timeline." "Accelerated by who?" Kyle demanded.
Whoa.
"Who decided that my wife needed to be humiliated publicly? Who planned this whole evening to make me look like an idiot?" "No one planned anything," I said firmly. "Kyle, you created this situation entirely by yourself. You spent years treating me like an intellectual accessory while claiming expertise in work you'd never bothered to understand. Tonight's revelation was simply the natural consequence of that behavior." "Natural consequence?" Kyle's laugh was bitter and desperate. "The natural consequence of loving someone, of building a life together, of trusting my partner to be honest with me. The natural consequence of taking your partner for granted," I corrected. "Of assuming that your career was more important than hers. Of never showing enough interest in her work to discover that she was revolutionizing an entire industry." The words seemed to drain the fight out of Kyle. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time all evening he looked less angry than simply broken. 5 years, he said quietly. 5 years, and I never knew who you really were." "You never asked," I replied gently. "You were so focused on who you needed me to be that you never showed curiosity about who I actually was." Ryan Miles appeared at Kyle's elbow, his expression carefully professional but concerned. "Kyle, Perhaps we should step outside, get some air, discuss the implications of tonight's developments. Kyle looked at him with the expression of someone finally understanding that his professional relationships had been fundamentally altered by the evening's revelations. Implications for what? My career? My future at Holloway Industries? My prospects for advancement, now that everyone knows I've been presenting my wife's work as my own insights. Ryan's discomfort was obvious. We should discuss this privately. There's nothing left to discuss privately, Kyle said with sudden clarity. Is there, Ryan? My professional reputation is finished. Everyone in this room now knows that I've been confidently presenting revolutionary logistics strategies while having no idea they were developed by the woman I dismissed as having little consulting projects. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Around us, executives who had spent the evening networking suddenly found themselves reconsidering every interaction they'd had with Kyle over the years. Kyle, I said softly, your professional reputation doesn't have to be finished. But it will need to be rebuilt on your actual capabilities rather than borrowed expertise you never understood. And us? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Is that finished too? I looked at this man I'd been married to for 5 years. This person who had shared my bed and my daily life while never bothering to discover that I was transforming an entire industry. The sadness I felt was profound, but it was the sadness of mourning something that had never really existed. Kyle, we were never really S's in the way that mattered. We were you, with me as a supporting character in your professional narrative. Tonight made it impossible to continue that dynamic. So you're choosing your career over our marriage. I'm choosing authenticity over accommodation. I'm choosing to be seen for who I actually am instead of who you needed me to be. Kyle nodded slowly, finally understanding that this wasn't a fight he could win because it had never really been a fight at all. It was simply the moment when 5 years of fundamental misunderstanding finally became impossible to ignore. I suppose, he said with resignation. There's nothing left to say. There's one thing, I replied, reaching into my purse and withdrawing an envelope I'd been carrying all evening. Divorce papers. Filed this morning. I was hoping we could discuss this privately, but tonight's events have made privacy impossible. Kyle took the envelope with trembling hands, staring at it as if it contained his death sentence. In many ways, it did. Kyle opened the envelope with mechanical precision, his fingers working despite the obvious tremor in his hands. The legal documents rustled in the absolute silence of the ballroom, the sound amplified by 300 people holding their collective breath. Filed this morning, he read aloud, his voice hollow. Irreconcilable differences. Division of assets. His voice trailed off as he scanned the pages, his face growing paler with each paragraph. You'll find the financial arrangements quite generous, I said quietly. I've never been vindictive, Kyle, just tired of being invisible. Generous, he repeated, looking up from the papers with something approaching hysteria in his eyes. You're giving me an allowance from your secret fortune. How generous indeed. I'm giving you exactly what you contributed to our partnership, I corrected. The house will be yours, along with half of our joint savings and your full pension. You'll be financially comfortable. Financially comfortable. Kyle laughed bitterly. While you become one of the most powerful executives in corporate America. Yes, I can see how that's equitable. Patricia Webb stepped forward, her expression professionally sympathetic but firm. Kyle, I think it would be best if you took some time to process tonight's developments privately. This public forum isn't serving anyone's interests. Public forum. Kyle turned on her with renewed anger. This was supposed to be my company's Christmas party. This was supposed to be my networking opportunity. Instead, it's become the public execution of my professional and personal life. No one executed anything, I said firmly. Kyle, you spent this entire evening confidently presenting my work as your own insights. You dismissed my expertise while simultaneously depending on it to advance your career. Tonight simply made those contradictions impossible to ignore. Because you planned it that way. I planned nothing. Global Commerce International approached me about the acquisition months ago. Patricia's presence here tonight was coincidental. She's been attending industry events for years. Bradley's decision to make the announcement public was spontaneous, based on the conversations he'd observed. Kyle looked around the silent ballroom, taking in the faces of colleagues who were studying him with mixtures of fascination, pity, and professional calculation. His career at Holloway Industries was effectively over, not because of any formal action, but because his credibility had been so thoroughly demolished that recovery would be impossible. So that's it, he said, finally. 5 years of marriage dismissed with legal paperwork. My career, destroyed by revelations I never saw coming. My future, redefined by discoveries I was never allowed to make. You were allowed to make them, I replied gently. I talked about my work constantly, Kyle. I invited you to my office dozens of times. I sent you copies of my published papers. I mentioned conferences and client meetings and business developments. You chose not to pay attention because you decided my work wasn't important enough to warrant your interest. The accusation hit its target with devastating accuracy. Kyle's shoulders sagged as he finally confronted the magnitude of his own willful ignorance. I thought, he began, then stopped. I thought I was the successful one. I thought I was the one with the important career, the strategic vision, the industry expertise. I thought you were supporting my ambitions while pursuing your own little interests on the side. And therein lies the problem, Patricia observed. You thought your career was important and hers was supplementary. You thought your success mattered and hers was decorative. You thought your expertise was valuable and hers was amateur. Because she let me think that, Kyle protested desperately. No, I said firmly. Because you needed to think that. Because acknowledging the true scope of my achievements would have threatened your self-image as the successful partner in our marriage. Bradley Holloway, who had been observing the exchange with professional fascination, finally intervened. Kyle, I think Ryan's suggestion about getting some air is wise. This conversation has reached its natural conclusion. Has it? Kyle looked around the ballroom one final time, his gaze taking in the faces of colleagues who would remember this evening for the rest of their careers. Has it really concluded, or is this just the beginning of my professional destruction? That depends entirely on you, I replied. Kyle, you have legitimate skills and real knowledge about logistics operations. But you'll need to rebuild your reputation based on what you actually know, rather than what you've been claiming to understand. And personally? What about us personally? The question hung in the air between us, freighted with 5 years of shared history and mutual misunderstanding. I looked at this man who had been my husband, this person who had loved me according to his own limitations while never bothering to discover who I actually was. Personally, Kyle, we should have had this conversation years ago. We should have established mutual respect and genuine partnership from the beginning. But we didn't, and now it's too late. Because you're leaving. Because you never really saw me in the first place. Kyle folded the divorce papers carefully, sliding them back into their envelope with the same mechanical precision he'd used to open them. When he looked up, his eyes held a clarity they'd lacked all evening. I suppose, he said with quiet dignity, there's nothing left to fight for if there was never really anything there to begin with. I'm sorry, I said and meant it. I'm sorry we couldn't find a way to build something real together. Kyle nodded once, turned without another word and walked toward the ballroom exit. His stride was steadier now, as if accepting the inevitable had given him back some measure of control over his own movements. Ryan Miles hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between professional obligations and personal concern, then followed Kyle toward the exit. Several other Holloway Industries executives exchanged glances before discreetly making their own departures. In the space of 10 minutes, the ballroom had transformed from a networking event into a wake for a marriage that had never really existed and a career that had been built on borrowed expertise. I remained on the stage, looking out over an audience that now saw me completely differently than they had when the evening began. The silence that followed Kyle's departure was different from the shocked quiet that had dominated the earlier confrontation. This was contemplative, expectant, the silence of people processing a fundamental shift in their understanding of power dynamics and professional relationships. I stepped back to the microphone, feeling the weight of 300 pairs of eyes focused on me with an intensity that had nothing to do with polite corporate courtesy. "Well," I said, allowing a slight smile to play across my lips, "that was certainly more dramatic than anyone expected from a Christmas party." A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the audience, breaking some of the tension that had built during the previous hour. "I want to thank you all for witnessing what was undoubtedly the most honest conversation Kyle and I have had in 5 years of marriage," I continued, "though I suspect you all would have preferred to observe it from a greater distance." More laughter now, genuine rather than nervous, as people began to relax into this new dynamic. "What you've seen tonight is something that happens in boardrooms and conference rooms across the country every day, the systematic dismissal of expertise based on assumptions about whose contributions matter. The difference is that tonight, those assumptions were challenged publicly." I paused, scanning the faces before me. The wives' corner had completely dissolved. Miranda was standing with a group of executives, Sandra was deep in conversation with the hotel's architect about design innovations, and Sharon Miles was networking with the confidence of someone whose professional background had suddenly become relevant again. Starting in January, I'll be moving to New York to begin my role as CEO of Global Commerce International's Innovation Division. But before I leave Minneapolis, I want to make something very clear: what happened here tonight wasn't about revenge or humiliation. It was about the cost of invisibility. The ballroom was completely silent again, but this time the quiet was engaged, focused. For 5 years, I allowed myself to be professionally invisible because it seemed easier than challenging assumptions. I accommodated dismissal, accepted diminishment, and enabled my own erasure because confronting the truth felt too difficult, too disruptive, too uncomfortable. But invisibility has its own costs. When you allow others to define your worth, you lose more than just professional recognition, you lose yourself. Tonight was about reclaiming not just my career, but my right to be seen for who I actually am. Patricia Webb began to applaud, slowly and deliberately. The sound was picked up by others until the entire ballroom was clapping, not the polite corporate applause of earlier announcements, but something deeper, more personal. "To the women in this room," I said as the applause died down, "I hope tonight serves as a reminder that your expertise doesn't disappear just because someone chooses not to see it. Your achievements don't become less significant because they're inconvenient for someone else's narrative." And to everyone else, I hope tonight demonstrates that innovation and leadership can come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the most revolutionary solutions are created by the people you've been systematically overlooking. I stepped back from the microphone and walked down from the stage, but instead of the isolation I'd felt earlier in the evening, I found myself surrounded by colleagues, peers, and industry leaders who finally saw me as I'd always been, not Kyle Sampson's supportive wife, but Amanda Reynolds, CEO. The Christmas party continued around us, but it had become something entirely different from what anyone had expected when they'd arrived. It had become a celebration of visibility, authenticity, and the courage to claim your own worth in a world that prefers you to remain conveniently small. As I accepted congratulations and discussed future collaborations with executives who had ignored me hours earlier, I realized that the woman who had once poured coffee while being dismissed as just a pretty face was gone forever. In her place stood someone who would never again allow herself to be smaller than she actually was. The 42nd floor of the Global Commerce International Tower in Manhattan offered a view that stretched from Central Park to the Hudson River, a daily reminder of how far I'd traveled from that Christmas party in Minneapolis. My corner office was everything I'd never dared to imagine when I was sitting in the wives' corner, making polite conversation while my husband claimed credit for my innovations. "The quarterly numbers are exceptional," Miranda Holloway said, setting the reports on my desk. She'd followed me to New York after accepting a position as my chief legal counsel, bringing with her a fierce intelligence that had been wasted on charity event planning. "The innovation division has exceeded projections by 42%. And the Henderson retail expansion, ahead of schedule and under budget. They're already requesting our next-generation algorithms for their European operations." Miranda's smile was genuinely pleased. "It's remarkable what happens when innovation isn't constrained by people who don't understand it." I nodded, reviewing the financial summaries that represented not just corporate success but personal vindication. The company I'd built in secret had become the foundation for something even more ambitious, a division that was reshaping how Fortune 500 companies thought about supply chain management. "Any word from Minneapolis?" Miranda asked carefully. "Ryan Miles sent a note last week. Holloway Industries is implementing our systems company-wide. Apparently they finally realized they needed expertise rather than assumptions about expertise. And Kyle," I looked up from the reports considering how to answer. The question had become less painful over the months, though it still carried the weight of 5 years that had been both wasted and necessary for bringing me to this moment. "Kyle started his own consulting firm," I said finally. "Small scale, regional clients, actual implementation rather than borrowed theories. From what I hear, he's doing well by learning to work within his actual capabilities rather than claiming expertise he never possessed. That's surprisingly mature of him." "Failure has a way of forcing growth," I replied. "The Kyle who was exposed at the Christmas party couldn't have survived in his old role. The man he's becoming might actually build something sustainable." Miranda nodded thoughtfully. "Do you ever regret how it ended?" "The public nature of it, I mean," I considered the question while looking out at the Manhattan skyline. 6 months ago, I'd been invisible, professionally erased, accommodating assumptions that diminished everything I'd worked to build. Today I was running a division that employed 300 people and generated revenue that exceeded most mid-sized companies. "I regret that it took so long," I said finally. "I regret the years I spent making myself smaller to accommodate someone else's limitations. But the ending itself, no. Some truths are too large to be revealed quietly." The industry certainly took notice. Harvard Business School wants to do a case study on the evening. They're calling it the Christmas Party Revolution. I laughed, a sound that had become easier over the months. Let them. If it helps other women recognize that their expertise doesn't disappear just because someone chooses not to see it, then maybe something good came from the worst evening of Kyle's life. A knock on my office door interrupted our conversation, and my assistant announced that Patricia Webb had arrived for our monthly strategic planning meeting. Patricia had become not just a colleague but a mentor, someone who understood the unique challenges of being a woman in an industry that preferred to overlook female expertise. "Ready to change the world?" Patricia asked as she entered, carrying the latest research from our development team. "Again?" I replied with a smile. "I thought we did that last quarter." "Last quarter was just the beginning," Patricia said, spreading diagrams across my conference table. Wait until you see what we're planning for next year. As we dove into discussions of next-generation technologies and strategic implementations, I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from being seen, recognized, and valued for who you actually are rather than who someone needs you to be. The woman who had stood in the wives' corner, dismissed and diminished, was gone forever. In her place was someone who had learned the most important lesson of all: never let anyone convince you that you're smaller than you actually are. And when you finally step into your power, make sure you hold the door open for others who are still finding their way. 3 weeks later, I was reviewing contracts in my office when Miranda knocked and entered with an expression I'd learned to recognize as significant news. "There's someone here to see you," she said carefully. "No appointment, but he says it's important. Kyle Sampson." I looked up from the documents, feeling a familiar tightness in my chest. 6 months had passed since that Christmas party, 6 months since I'd walked away from a marriage that had never really existed. I'd assumed our paths would never cross again. Did he say what he wanted? Just that he was hoping for a few minutes of your time. "He looks." Miranda paused, searching for the right word. "Different." Humbled maybe. I considered refusing. My life had moved forward with remarkable momentum since leaving Minneapolis, and I'd worked hard to build something that existed entirely separate from the woman I'd been when I was married to Kyle. But curiosity won. "Send him in," I said, "but stay nearby." Kyle entered my office, looking indeed different from the confident networking executive I'd left behind. He was thinner, his expensive suit replaced by business casual clothing that suggested a more modest professional circumstance. Most notably, his demeanor had lost the aggressive certainty that had characterized him throughout our marriage. "Amanda," he said, remaining standing near the door.
"Thank you for seeing me."
"I know you have no reason to. What can I do for you, Kyle?" He looked around the office, taking in the Manhattan skyline view, the awards on the walls, the obvious markers of success that dwarfed anything he'd achieved during our marriage. "I wanted to apologize," he said finally. "Not for the divorce, not for how things ended. You were right about all of that. I wanted to apologize for the 5 years before that." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving motivation. Instead, I saw something I'd rarely encountered during our marriage: genuine humility. "Go on," I said. "I've spent the last 6 months in therapy, trying to understand how I could have been so completely blind to who you actually were. How I could have lived with someone for 5 years without ever really seeing them." Kyle moved slightly closer, but remained respectfully distant. I convinced myself that I was the successful one, the important one, the one whose career mattered. I needed that to be true so badly that I made myself incapable of recognizing evidence to the contrary. And now I understand that I wasn't protecting my ego. I was destroying everything that made our relationship valuable. I took a brilliant, accomplished woman and convinced her to make herself invisible, so I could feel important. The admission was more honest than anything Kyle had ever said to me during our marriage. I found myself genuinely curious about what had prompted this level of self-reflection. "What changed?" I asked. Kyle's smile was rueful. "Failure has a way of clarifying things. After the Christmas party, my reputation at Holloway Industries was effectively destroyed. Not because anyone punished me, but because everyone finally understood that I'd been claiming expertise I didn't possess. Miranda mentioned you started your own firm, small-scale logistics consulting. I work with regional businesses on practical implementations, things I actually understand rather than revolutionary theories I never bothered to learn." He paused. "It's humbling work, but it's honest. For the first time in years, I'm succeeding based on what I actually know rather than what I could convince people I knew." I found myself genuinely pleased by this development. The Kyle standing in my office bore little resemblance to the man who had dismissed my achievements while claiming credit for my innovations. "I'm glad you found your footing," I said, and meant it. "I came here today because I wanted you to know that I finally understand what I lost. Not just a marriage, but the opportunity to be genuinely partnered with someone extraordinary. I spent 5 years with one of the most innovative minds in our industry, and learned nothing from the experience because I was too threatened to pay attention." Kyle took a step back toward the door. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I finally see you clearly, and I understand how remarkable you've always been." "Thank you," I said quietly. "That means more than you might realize." Kyle nodded, understanding that our conversation was reaching its natural conclusion. But as he turned toward the door, I found myself speaking again. "Kyle, wait." He paused, turning back with an expression of cautious hope. "There's something I want you to know," I said, rising from my chair and walking to the window. The Manhattan skyline stretched before us, a testament to ambition and achievement that felt both humbling and empowering. "The woman you were married to, the one who accommodated your assumptions and made herself smaller, she needed to disappear. But that doesn't mean our entire relationship was worthless." Kyle remained silent, clearly afraid that speaking might interrupt whatever revelation was coming. "You loved me according to your limitations," I continued. "That love was real, even if it was incomplete. And for a long time, I loved you according to mine, accepting diminishment because it felt easier than demanding recognition." I turned from the window to face him directly. "Neither of us was entirely wrong, Kyle. We were just fundamentally incompatible in ways we were too afraid to acknowledge." "Incompatible how?" "You needed to be the successful partner, and I needed to be seen for who I actually was. Those requirements couldn't coexist in the same relationship." Kyle considered this, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "So there was never really a path forward for us. Not as the people we were then," I replied honestly. "But maybe there could have been, if we'd both been willing to grow earlier instead of protecting our comfort illusions." The admission hung between us, carrying the weight of 5 years and the recognition that some relationships are learning experiences, rather than permanent partnerships. "For what it's worth," Kyle said quietly, "I'm proud of what you've accomplished. Not just professionally, but personally. It took courage to walk away from something that wasn't working, even when it looked successful from the outside. And it took courage for you to rebuild your career based on honesty rather than borrowed expertise." I replied, "The Kyle who's standing in my office today is someone I could respect as a colleague, even if we could never work as spouses." There was something healing in this acknowledgement, not reconciliation but recognition that growth was possible even after devastating failure. "One more thing," Kyle said, reaching into his briefcase and withdrawing a manila folder. "I brought something that belongs to you." He handed me the folder, and when I opened it, I found copies of academic papers, conference presentations, and industry articles, all of my published work that he'd apparently collected over the years. "I found these in my files," he explained. "Apparently, I had been saving your work all along, even when I wasn't paying attention to it. I thought you might want them back." I flipped through the papers, seeing my own words and theories that Kyle had been casually dismissing while simultaneously preserving. The irony was perfect. He'd been documenting my expertise, even while claiming not to understand it. "Keep them," I said, closing the folder and handing it back. "Consider them a reminder of what happens when you actually pay attention to the people in your life." Kyle accepted the folder with a rueful smile. "I'll do that." As he prepared to leave for the final time, I felt a sense of closure that had been missing since that Christmas party. We hadn't reconciled, that would never be possible, but we'd reached an understanding that allowed both of us to move forward without bitterness. Kyle, I said as he reached the door.
Yes?
I hope your new business succeeds. Not because I forgive you, but because you deserve to build something based on who you actually are, rather than who you thought you needed to be. Thank you, Amanda, for everything. Even for the Christmas party. Even for the Christmas party. Kyle's smile was genuine now, free of the desperation that had characterized our final confrontation, especially for the Christmas party. It was the most honest conversation we ever had. With that, he left my office and my life for the final time, leaving me alone with the view of Manhattan and the recognition that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. 2 years later, I stood at the podium of the International Business Leadership Conference in Chicago, looking out at an audience of 1,500 executives, entrepreneurs, and academics. The same city where Kyle and I had first met 6 years earlier, when I was still convinced that love meant making yourself smaller to fit someone else's vision of partnership. The story I'm about to tell you, I began, started at a Christmas party where I was introduced as someone who keeps busy with little hobbies while standing next to a man who had built his professional reputation on theories I'd developed but never bothered to understand. A ripple of recognition passed through the audience. The Christmas party revolution had become a case study taught in business schools across the country, but this was the first time I'd spoken publicly about the personal details of that evening. Raise your hand if you've ever been in a meeting where someone else received credit for your ideas. I continued. Nearly every hand in the audience went up. Keep your hand raised if you've ever remained silent in that moment, because challenging the misattribution felt too risky, too uncomfortable, or too disruptive. Most hands stayed up. Now keep your hand raised if you've ever wondered what might happen if you stopped accommodating that dynamic and started demanding recognition for your actual contributions. I smiled as I looked out at the forest of raised hands. That last question is why we're here today. For the next 45 minutes, I outlined the principles that had emerged from my own experience and the research I'd conducted since joining GCI. The systematic nature of professional invisibility, the psychology of accommodation versus assertion, the business case for recognizing expertise, regardless of its source. The most dangerous phrase in corporate America, I concluded, isn't "we've always done it this way," or "if it isn't broken, don't fix it." The most dangerous phrase is "I never thought to ask." My husband spent 5 years married to one of the most successful logistics consultants in the country and never thought to ask about the details of my work. My colleagues spent years implementing my innovations and never thought to ask about their origins. My industry spent months analyzing my case studies and never thought to ask who had actually developed the strategies. I paused, scanning the faces before me. The question isn't whether there are brilliant, innovative people being systematically overlooked in your organizations. The question is whether you're thinking to ask who they are. The applause was immediate and sustained, but I held up a hand for silence. There's one more thing I want to share. Last month I received a letter from a woman in Portland who attended a leadership conference where I'd spoken about professional visibility. She wrote to tell me that she'd finally found the courage to correct her boss when he presented her marketing strategy as his own insight during a board meeting. The result, she was promoted to creative director and given a team to implement her vision company-wide. Her boss, interestingly, was also promoted to a role that better matched his actual skills in management rather than creative development. I smiled at the memory of that letter, one of dozens I'd received from women who had decided to stop making themselves invisible. That story illustrates something crucial: recognizing expertise doesn't diminish other people's contributions. It simply ensures that credit goes where it belongs, allowing everyone to succeed based on their actual capabilities rather than borrowed authority. My ex-husband Kyle is now running a successful consulting firm in Minneapolis, building his reputation on honest expertise rather than claimed innovations. Our divorce didn't destroy his career, it forced him to discover what he was actually good at. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is stop enabling their professional dishonesty. The audience erupted in applause again, and this time I let it continue until it died down naturally. 3 years ago, I was standing in a hotel ballroom, dismissed as a corporate wife with little consulting projects while my own innovations were being presented as someone else's insights. Today, I'm running a division that's reshaping how Fortune 500 companies think about supply chain management. The difference wasn't just about claiming recognition for my work, the difference was about refusing to be smaller than I actually was. I stepped back from the podium, as the audience rose in a standing ovation, but my thoughts were already on the conversations that would follow, with executives who had brilliant people in their organizations that they'd never noticed, with women who were tired of being professionally invisible, with leaders who were ready to ask the questions they'd never thought to ask.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.